Just
This
on mute.
conference will now be recorded.
Tonight is episode 2 of the Panama Canal. This is what the canal plan looked like by 1910. I just thought it would be interesting to look at where the locks are, the lake was. This is the Atlantic Ocean heading southwest to Panama City. I'm going to briefly run over the major milestones in the American Canal. In 1889, the French Canal went bankrupt. In 1902, the U.S. Senate voted to pursue an American effort in Panama. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that decision was made. In 1903, the U.S. concluded a treaty with the Republic of Panama, which didn't exist in 1902. In 1905, construction began on what was initially considered to be a sea level canal. That was what the United States was going to build. In 1906, the design was altered to a lock canal. In 1914, the canal opened. I want to talk in particular about 3 participants in the story, 2 of whom you might not have ever heard of. Teddy Roosevelt, you know. This Senator John Tyler Morgan was a player, but the man on the right was key to many of the major transactions. I had never even heard his name, much less about his involvement. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, 1858, 1919. In 1901, he was a very new vice president under William McKinley. McKinley was assassinated in 1901. At the age of 42, he became president of the United States and served from 1901 until 1909. He was both progressive and expansionist, which to some people would be considered an oxymoron. But he considered manifest destiny to include naval power on both oceans. And he also was absolutely convinced that he needed to have the capability to cross over from one to the other easily. He got that from the Spanish-American War, when they had so much trouble fighting in 2 oceans and not being able to get from one to the other. Initially, Teddy supported the canal plan for Nicaragua, but then he came to accept the Panama plan. He played an integral role in the formation of the Republic of Panama, and I'm going to talk about how Panama became a republic, and to a little bit of a degree what Teddy Roosevelt did to help make that happen. It wasn't a lot different from Diem being assassinated 60 years later. Now first, I want to introduce you to Senator John Tyler Morgan. John Tyler Morgan had been a general in the Confederate Army. He was a 6-term United States Senator from Alabama. He was chairman of a committee called the Inter-Ocean Canal Committee from 1899 until 1903. He was the key man in the Senate to determine where the canal was going to be located. He was very much of an expansionist. Between 1887 and 1907, he played a leading role on the Foreign Relations Committee, in addition to being on the Committee on Interocean Canals. He wanted a canal linking the oceans through Nicaragua. He also wanted to enlarge the Navy. He wanted to acquire Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba. He was very much an empire builder. He considered Nicaragua, and this question was asked last time, the proper location for primarily one reason: its proximity to southern ports. It also had the lowest altitude to cross. And remember, at this time, they were still thinking that they were going to build a sea level canal. For him, Nicaragua was a stable country compared to Panama, which was not, and that proved to be true. It was free of disease. It had a large lake that would supply the canal, and we already had treaties in place with the Nicaraguan government in the United States Senate. Remember John Morgan. Now, this man you've never heard of, or at least I'd never heard of him, Philippe Bounau Verila. He was a French engineer and a soldier. He had been one of de Lesseps's most able assistants in the French effort to build the canal. He was a shareholder in the company that went bankrupt. Remember the French Canal Company? He was intimately involved in the American political process to choose the site of the canal, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. At this point in time, it is still going to Nicaragua. He was also, and this is part of the motivation for him being involved in the site, he was involved in the sale of the French assets. He was also the go-between in the Panamanian Revolution. He was the signatory to the treaty with the new republic. And how a man like this got his fingers in so many different pies so quickly is really a very fascinating story. He was a player of the first order of magnitude.
George,
Now, sir,
with Lesseps, you said he was a close friend of Lesseps.
I said he was on the Lessep's staff. I didn't say, I don't know how friendly they were.
I was just wondering, did he have anything to do with anything in the Suez Canal when
No,
Lesseps did?
I don't
Okay.
think so. I think he was involved in the French Panama Canal, but I don't think he had anything to do with the Suez Canal. Maybe he was too young. Okay, here's a simplistic overview of the controversy between where to put the canal, whether Nicaragua or Panama. Now, if you look at this chart pretty clearly guides you to Panama. Panama is a third the length. The transit time is a third. It would require fewer locks. There was a railroad already in place in Panama. Panama had a harbor at each end. The costs were relatively, as they were doing and they must have been pretty high order cost estimates, but they thought that each canal would cost about $350 million. But when it was finished, it would be less costly to operate Panama. Panama had no seismic or volcanic activity, and there was volcanic activity and seismic activity in Nicaragua. So if you looked at it this way, you'd say that's a simple and straightforward decision. But remember, Morgan was heels dug in on Nicaragua. The decision to fund and build the canal and its location rested in the United States Senate. Morgan was adamantly in favor of Nicaragua. Mark Hanna, who was also a very powerful senator, favored Panama. Teddy Roosevelt really wasn't that much of a factor in terms of which country did it go in. Behind the scenes, though, this Bounau Verila was lobbying very strongly for Panama, and as you saw earlier, he had more than one reason for doing that. And one of the things that he did right before the Senate vote was taken, he sent every U.S. senator a Nicaragua stamp that showed a volcano on it. Never mind whether or not that was representative of Nicaragua or not. The Senate vote was Panama 42, Nicaragua 36. Then they passed almost immediately something called the Spooner Act, and that's what you see on the right. That was passed in June of 1902. Morgan made 64 different motions to amend the Spooner Act, all of which failed. As soon as the Senate, and the House does not involve in treaties. So this is solely in the Senate, even though the money for it, I think, would have to come from both. It was signed by Teddy Roosevelt the day after the Senate passed it. Now let's talk about treaties. This is more entertainment. Secretary of State John Hay. Does anybody know who he was? He was Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary during the Civil War. He negotiated a treaty with Colombia called the Hay-Herran Treaty in January of 1903. So as soon as the Spooner Act was passed, they started negotiating a treaty. It would pay Colombia $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000. It was almost immediately ratified by the U.S. Senate. However, the Colombian Senate refused to ratify it. Basically, they wanted more money. Teddy was pissed. He let it be known that he would not be displeased if the Panamanians revolted. He sent the USS Nashville, and the USS Nashville is a gunboat as opposed to any other kind of ship. And what that meant was it was capable of bombarding, but not of fighting other ships, to protect American lives in Panama. At the same time, the Colombians sent the Cartagena with 500 men on it, and they landed those 500 men in Colón. They did not get to Panama City. The captain of the Nashville kept them from getting on the railroad to go across the isthmus. Panama City revolted. Reading the story of the revolution, it's really interesting because the Colombian generals who were in Panama City had almost no troops. The troops were across the isthmus and couldn't do anything about it. The revolutionaries then formed a government, and there was a lot of money that changed hands, most of which came from the United States. Almost immediately, something called the Hay, now here's this man again, Bounau Verila treaty was signed the 18th of November, almost immediately. It offered the Republic of Panama the same incentives for the right to build, fortify, and control a 10-mile wide canal zone in perpetuity. And if you read the details that were behind all this, the United States government, Teddy Roosevelt in particular, was the puppet master of this whole transaction. Now, we now have agreement to build a canal in Panama. We now have the U.S. Senate lined up. We now have the Panamanian government lined up. How are we going to build it? And I want to talk in particular about three people: John Stevens, George Washington Goethals, and William C. Gorgas. There were a lot of people who played key roles beyond these three, but these were the most important ones in the construction of the canal. Initial management, though, actually lay in the hands of someone named John Finley Wallace. It was conceived as a military project. It was funded by the U.S. government, but the scope of what they were going to do was not clear. So like everything else, this man Wallace, he had been the general manager of the Illinois Central Railroad. He was a visionary, but he accomplished almost nothing. And one of the reasons he couldn't do anything was there was a 7-man commission in the United States which rarely agreed on anything. And they drove Wallace crazy. He was not a good project manager. He didn't realize how to work the system, he was really handcuffed down in Panama. By 1905, just a little over a year, they had spent $130 million and they still had no overall plan. It wasn't clear even whether or not it was going to be a sea level canal or one constructed with locks and dams. They just had such a contorted, convoluted decision-making process that nothing was getting done. As a result, a year later, mired in red tape, Wallace said the whole dadgum thing was a mistake and he quit. Now I'm going to talk about 5 different elements of the canal construction: infrastructure, sanitation, the Gatun Dam, the Gaillard Cut, and locks. The Gaillard Cut became the Calibra Cut. That's what it was to begin with. The man Gaillard was the lieutenant colonel in charge of that particular section of the canal. Now, infrastructure. First thing that the United States did was send down 100 steam-mounted or railroad-mounted steam shovels. They also brought in steam-powered cranes, rock crushers, concrete mixers, dredges, power drills. By the way, on the right, that the picture you see of that crane, that's Teddy Roosevelt sitting in the driver's seat. That is the first time a sitting president of the United States ever left continental United States. These equipment were all new machine building technology that had been developed and built in the United States. They rebuilt the rail system. They strengthened the rail system. Heavy duty double track rails were installed. And of the things that I had read prior to this, the primary reason that the American Canal was successful and the French Canal failed was because the rail system that we built was capable of removing the spoil from the work site. They did not do that when the French did the canal. All of the facilities, they bought $40 million worth of facilities from the French. They renovated them, they expanded them, they built new maintenance facilities, they built new storage facilities. In other words, in that first year, the one thing they did get accomplished was they got a start on infrastructure. Now I want to talk about John Frank Stevens. This is a pretty important person in the life of the canal. He was a civil engineer. Prior to the canal, he had built the Great Northern Railroad. He was a very good administrator, and he had excellent technical skills and imagination around railroading, and that's important. He had built over 1,000 miles of railroad before the canal. He had been working for the Great Northern Railroad. Teddy's Secretary of War, Howard Taft, hired him as the chief engineer to replace the previous chief engineer in 1905. His primary achievements, and there were really 2. One was he built the infrastructure, especially the railroad part of the infrastructure, and he convinced Teddy and the United States Senate to build a lock canal. That was not a simple decision. Sanitation. Tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever had plagued the French effort. It had killed 22,000 workers at the least and contributed heavily to its failure. A doctor named William Gorgas, and I believe he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army Medical Corps, was responsible for fixing that. Gorgas believed in the medical theories advanced by Dr. Major Walter Reed that mosquitoes transmitted these tropical illnesses. He was the chief sanitary officer in the canal zone, and he declared war on mosquitoes. He required copper screening in all hospitals, all administrative buildings, hotels, and even in homes. He mandated fumigations. He banned open cisterns. He had thousands of drainage ditches built. He ordered all vegetation cut near populated areas and oil sprayed on the surface of bogs and swamps. Disease rates plummeted under Gorges's leadership. Now here's the man that you might have heard the name of, George Washington Goethals. He graduated second in his class at the military academy in 1880. He joined the Army Corps of Engineers. First he taught at the military academy. Then he actually came to Alabama and built the Muscle Shoals Canal. He included in that canal building something called the Riverton Lock, and I don't know if it's still there or not, but it had a 26-foot lift. At the time, one of the higher lift canals in the world. After Stevens resigned, Roosevelt chose him and the Corps of Engineers to lead the project. At about this time, and I don't know if he was the role model that Leslie Groves used later on to say, I don't want a committee in Washington leading the Manhattan Project. Well, he didn't have a committee in Washington leading the Panama Canal project. He was responsible only to the Secretary of War, that was Taft, and the President. There was no committee behind every single decision, second guessing everything that he did. He directed the project to the successful conclusion in 1914. He was 2 years ahead of the target of June 1916. After the canal was built, he became the civil governor of the Panama Canal Zone. He then became the acting quartermaster general of the United States Army during World War I. He is a very, very important person in American project history. Now I'm going to talk about the three components of the canal. First, the Calibra Cut. It was called the special wonder of the canal. They had to dig a trench 300 feet deep, half a mile wide at the top, and 9 miles long. And much of it was rock. Holes were drilled, filled with explosives, and then steam shovels excavated the spoils, placed it on railroad cars, and they hauled it to dump sites. And the dump sites were not close by. 60 million pounds of dynamite were placed to blow up the rock, then removed by as many as 150 trains per day. The average distance that the spoil was hauled was 9 miles. Among other things, they used it to build the Gatun Dam and many other facilities. They built an island and built a city on it with spoil from the Calibra Cut. Earth slides were a constant concern. The first major earth, and that's what the other thing that killed the French. The first major slide occurred at Cucaracha in 1907. 500,000 cubic yards of material slid into the cut after several days of heavy rain. The slope of this hill was a serious impediment. The deeper you went, the more it rained, the more trouble you had with earth slides. The excavation in the cut was 100 million cubic yards, twice the estimate that they went in with of what they were going to have to take out. Part of that was because of slides. Now, the Gatun Dam, heard me use that term before. Ships that cross the interior go through a very large lake, the largest man-made lake in the world at the time, Gatun Lake. It impounds 183 million cubic feet of water. It was the largest earthen dam ever conceived. Many engineers, now remember we're talking 1906, 1908, many engineers doubted the feasibility of the dam, but Goethals had confidence in it. He didn't have anybody sitting over his head saying, give me a 5-hour PowerPoint presentation so I can just agree with you or not agree with you. Train cars dumped rock from the Calibra Cut into 2 parallel ridges. So the ridges actually extended off of this picture from left to right. The ridges were 4,000 feet apart, so they were almost a mile apart. They were 60 feet high and they were 1.5 miles long. Dredges then pumped clay into the space between these 2 ridges. The clay that they dumped in came from surrounding river bottoms. In the center of the dam, that's here, engineers built a concrete spillway that could discharge 180,000 cubic feet of water a second if a flood threatened the canal. By the way, the canal does not come through this dam. The canal comes over here. The canal, the dam is to the southwest of the canal. The locks. And if this picture ain't impressive, I don't know what is. That's the Miraflores lock. That's what it looked like under construction. A colonel named Harry Hodges of the Corps of Engineers was responsible for designing the lock chambers and gates. They were the biggest locks in the world by far. This was one of the reasons they did not want to build a lock canal. Nobody really had very much knowledge about how to build something like this for a canal of this size. Hodges, though, had worked with Goethals on the Muscle Shoals Canal. He was also familiar with a fairly new building material. We call it concrete. The lock design relied on 4.5 million cubic yards of concrete. So just imagine what it took to mix the concrete, get it from where you were mixing it over to where you had built the forms to put it in. It just had to have been an incredibly labor-intensive effort. You didn't just call up the neighborhood concrete company and say, I want 4 million cubic yards designed or delivered over this kind of a schedule. They did it themselves. There were 5 locks in all, 3 on the Atlantic side at Gatun and 2 on the Pacific side. Each lock chamber was 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, and 80 feet tall. The locks required 46 primary and secondary gates, and each gate had 2 leaves. The original gates they built in 1905 are still in operation.
Just
I'm sorry? Grand opening. Plans were made for a grand celebration to appropriately mark the official opening of the canal on 15 August 1914. Remember that date. A fleet of international warships was scheduled to assemble off Hampton Roads in Virginia New Year's Day 1915, then sailed to San Francisco through the Panama Canal in time for the opening of something called the Panama Pacific International Exposition. But no such grand opening occurred. Instead, the guns of August opened the First World War, the first week in August of 1914. And all of a sudden, this Panama Canal, which was probably the most important event that was going on in the world in this era, became a backwater. The canal cement boat Ancon, which was piloted by a man named John Constantine, he was the canal's first pilot, made the first official transit. There were no international dignitaries in attendance. Now here's what the canal looks like in plan basis. Cross-section basis. Over here is the Atlantic Ocean. You go through the Gatun locks. You come into Gatun Lake. You go down through the San Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks to the Pacific Ocean. This last lock actually was necessary because we had talked a little bit earlier about the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean being on the same level. It's true they're on the same level, but the Pacific Ocean is much more tidal, and they needed to have this lock to deal with the tides, this one here. In 1935, by the 30s, they realized they had water level control problems. Even though they had that huge Gatun Lake, they still had problems controlling the water level. They had problems with it during the dry season. The water level in the dam would go down. They had problems with it in the wet season because there would be such an inflow from the tributaries to the lake that they also had trouble with it. So there were water level control problems for the first 30 years of the canal's operation. In 1935, the Madden Dam was completed. Now, this is still under the auspices of the United States government for $10 million. It was an essential part of the watershed. This lake had a maximum level of 250 feet above sea level. It can store 1/3 of the canal's annual water requirements. So if you go back to those 5 locks that you looked at, every time you raised and lowered a lock, you had to fill it with water. It came out of Gatun Lake, but then this lake fed Gatun Lake. And it was kind of what it took to take care of the dry season and also to control the flow into Gatun Lake during the rainy season. So it was built to control the torrential flow of the Chagres River into the navigational route at Gatun Lake. It also generates hydroelectric power, supplies Panama City fresh water. So in 35, this lake was built, and up until that time, they had some fairly serious issues. And I had often wondered, where did the water come from to take care of the Panama Canal, especially in the dry season? This is where it came from. Now, I bet you haven't ever heard of this. This was a Japanese plan to attack the canal. If you look in the upper right, that's a submarine, 6,000 feet long, a 6,500-ton displacement submarine. What you see on the bottom right is where bombers could be kept with their wings folded, seaplanes, and these submarines were part of a plan to attack the canal in 1944. Japan, by 1944, they knew that they were losing, and they were going to do anything to try to get the United States to agree to some kind of a negotiated settlement.
George,
Yes, did someone say anything?
just wonder, on that picture, it says 60,000.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
What?
That's a pump in the aisle, Jerry.
Oh, just checking if we were awake, huh? How long was it?
600 feet.
600 feet. Okay.
It's still a big boat.
Yeah, but
Okay.
not 12 miles.
Oh, right. But you can see where the airplanes were actually on in that picture, they were on the submarine out at the front of it. They organized the submarine flotilla and Air Corps in 1944. It had 4 of these I-400 AM class submarines and 12, and I believe that's called a Sarin bomber. Each submarine packed 3 Sarins in this 115-foot long watertight hangar from the bridge structure on the deck. Now, these boats were actually built. They were in their training as the war concluded. But their concept was to take these submarines underwater to the West Coast and attack the Panama Canal and American cities. Kind of the reverse of what Doolittle did when he bombed Tokyo. The war ended before they could be implemented. And the first Americans who saw these didn't know what they were looking at. They'd never seen anything like this. So this was the Japanese equivalent to the German V1 and V2 bomb. Transition. Panama had been trying to renegotiate that original treaty since it had been first signed in 1903. Following the Suez Crisis, you all remember what that was? That was when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Activity to renegotiate the treaty increased after the Suez Canal crisis. 1964, there was rioting there. And that precipitated a complete breakdown in American relations with Panama. At that time, their government was led by a man named Torrijos. He actually somehow managed to get the United Nations Security Council to be held in Panama City. And they got international support for their cause. Despite the objection of Strom Thurmond, Jimmy Carter, with the Senate voting 68 to 32, chose to relinquish control of the canal to Panama. Part of this choice was permanent neutrality. And it gave, and this is a very important little point, it gave the United States the right to use military force, if necessary, to keep the canal open. They then used that treaty as the rationale for the 1989 invasion of Panama and the overthrow of Noriega and the imprisonment of Noriega. Now, Panama Canal expansion project. The largest ship that could go through the original Panama Canal was what was called an Essex-class aircraft carrier. The Essex-class aircraft carrier, almost, you had to take the lights off of their posts in order to get it through. But they could get through during World War II with the normal aircraft carriers. The Essex-class was the last carrier that would fit. In 2006, and the ACP is the Panama Canal organization now, run primarily by Panamanians. They began to expand the canal in 2006. It was the largest project at the canal since its original construction. It doubled the capacity of the canal, and you can see chamber lengths changed, vessel lengths capability changed. I don't believe it will take a super tanker, but that's about the only ship that won't go in there now. The construction of 2 new lock complexes, one on the Atlantic side and another on the Pacific. And what that does is increase the capability in terms of how many ships go through over what period of time. It added access channels to the new locks. It widened channels. It also increased the Gatun Lake's maximum operating level. How they did that, I don't know. According to this Panama group, the project had an estimated cost of $5 billion. It was self-financed by tolls increases. And when we get to the end, I'll tell you what the income is from the canal today.
George, did they have to shut the canal down for this work? If so, how long?
No. If you looked at an overview of what this was, these were all parallel to the existing canal locks. So these are in addition to, not in lieu of.
So do they operate both at the same time now?
I think so, but I think they can, Jerry. But getting in and out of the locks is probably as hard as anything else because they're so tight.
Yeah, and they have enough water to operate both.
Well, they do since the 35 dam was built. Right. They wouldn't if that hadn't been true.
If you get a chance to go over the Chickamauga Dam, I guess it's southbound on 153,
Right.
look over, you got to sit in the passenger seat, so let somebody else drive.
Okay.
Look over at the lock construction that's going on. There is a huge hole and cofferdam on the south side of the dam right now that they're building the new locks in. It's amazing.
I had no idea until I did this, Chris, how complicated a lock was.
It's really interesting. Just you got to have somebody else driving so you can look and tell them to drive slow.
Okay.
Yeah, if you saw the news today, they had cameras down there at the lock. Chuck Fleischman was down there too.
Oh,
today.
good. Photo op, right?
Yeah,
Now
he
I'm
brought the
gonna tell
money with him to finish the locks.
He keeps getting it funded.
Yes, he does. I'm going to tell you about a Chinese financed canal project in Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan government announced a $50 billion plan to build another interocean canal that would rival Panama's. That announcement was made in 2011. It had real problems with environmental impact. But when those environmental issues have been eclipsed by uncertainty about the viability of the project. $50 billion better have a heck of an income if it's going to pay off. The contract between the Nicaraguan government, the canal's financial backer, who is a Chinese billionaire named Wang Jing, was originally to expire in 2019. As of right now, construction has not started. One of the Nicaraguan congressmen called the whole project a propaganda game, just a media show to continue generating false hopes for prosperity among Nicaraguans. Allegedly, the president of Nicaragua gave Wang this 2019 deadline. Nobody is clear about what its status is as of right now. So there is a Chinaman with a great deal of money still talking about building a canal across Nicaragua. This is the lake in Nicaragua that was supposed to be the primary feature that made Nicaragua preferable to Panama. Panama built a lake like this. Conclusions. The canal is accorded the status of one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. And if you look at the others that are on the list, for the most part, they are not necessarily the state of the art, like the Golden Gate Bridge is on the list. But it was the first suspension bridge of its size in the world. The Empire State Building is on the list. And again, there are bigger buildings, but this was the first of them. canal is on that list. Now, this is an I say. The success of the canal was due to the leadership of the U.S. Corps of Engineers, also the resources of the U.S. government, and the specific efforts to eradicate yellow fever. Those were the three critical elements of the canal's success. The future of the canal is less clear now than it ever was. There's a great deal of fear that China is going to build infrastructure in the canal zone and gain control of its operation. And that's the big bugaboo right now. The Chinese are spending a great deal of money in a lot of different places trying to gain control of those areas, building infrastructure. It's true in Africa, it's true in Central America. I'm not sure where else it's true. Now, just to conclude, some factoids. Excavation of the canal was the equivalent of digging a trench 10 feet deep, 55 feet wide from New York to California. That's what went into building the Panama Canal. Factoid 2, 75,000 men worked on the canal, 40,000 at one time at its peak. Of those, 5,600 died from disease and accidents. Gross income from the canal today is $1.4 billion a year. With operating costs of roughly $500 million a year, the canal nets a little under $1 billion a year. That's why you can see, going back to that $50 billion proposal to go across in Nicaragua, it would take a long time to pay out if you made $1 billion a year with it. And with that, I conclude my tale of the Panama Canal. Do you have any questions?
Yeah. Hey, George, do you know how much does it cost for one ship to go through?
It varies depending on the size of the ship. The big ships are $250,000, and it goes all the way down to one man swam the canal. They charged him, I think, 65 cents.
Charged them what?
65 cents.
Hey, George,
I heard the most expensive fee was 450,000.
I haven't heard one that big, but I won't argue with you. I don't believe it'll take a super tanker, so I'm not sure.
Hey,
George, question I have about this, and this Stevens was the chief engineer, and you praised him greatly, but then he was replaced by Goethals. Why did that happen?
Stevens resigned.
Why?
Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, he was a railroad man. He really didn't know anything about building a canal. Secondly, he was sick and damn tired of working with the bureaucracy. Third, evidently, he didn't like the military, among other things. And so he got crosswise with the process. He had done what he had come to do, and that is rebuilt the railroad infrastructure. And he knew a great deal about railroading, and he is given a great deal of credit for being able to move dirt around. But when they started building, they started digging and they started building locks and they started building a dam and whatnot, he had no experience in any of those things. So when you read about him leaving, he apparently got crosswise with Teddy Roosevelt about something. He got his dander up and he just said, "I quit." And if there's a better story than that, I couldn't find it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
George, I have two questions.
Sure.
In today's dollars, what did it cost to build the canal?
$1 trillion.
And second, did you read anything about environmental problems by mixing the Caribbean waters with the Pacific?
Well, you don't. Now think about it for a minute. You're using water. Well, you're using water from Gatun Lake.
which is fresh water,
Huh?
which is fresh water.
Which is fresh water. That's what's feeding the locks, Owen. So if you think about it, water is not going from the Pacific to the Atlantic.
Okay.
That sound right?
Yeah, I mean, it's going downhill in both directions.
Well, when you think of it, George, the reason you said that the locks that were put in the early 1900s are still in effect today. If it was salt water, that would not happen.
That's true. That is true. Have you ever seen pictures of the gates? They're immense. And they are steel, hollow structures with steel plate on them. And they are still operating.
Amazing, really.
It
Well,
really
do you
is.
know, do they have problems with that salt water at the Suez Canal? Because isn't that all salt water?
Remember, the Suez Canal is a sea level canal, Jerry.
But it's still built out of concrete and, iron gates.
No, it's
No?
not.
No locks. I
They
don't think there's any locks.
They are perennially
Gotcha.
dredging
Okay.
the canal, but to my knowledge, there isn't any concrete
Okay.
facilities in it. But you would be right. If they did have concrete, they'd play hell dealing with salt water.
Yep.
Hey, George, what was the drawbacks of doing a sea level canal at Panama?
Well, the biggest one is
Deeper hole.
cuts.
Yeah.
Much deeper. And the deeper you go, the more trouble you have with landslides. You have it. I think they looked at the French experience and they said, that ain't gonna work.
How high is it in the middle?
It's
How
not
high?
that high. It's about, I think 130 feet.
Above sea level.
Yeah. But that's a lot when you're dealing with millions and millions of cubic feet of water. Think about y'all have worked enough with water. I built some very, very small concrete abutments in Germany. And I learned that the pressure, even 6 feet down, is surprising. It's not 3 inches of mercury. It's really severe. I think that the Gatun Dam, if I remember correctly, at its base is something like, I want to say, half a mile thick. That's how thick it has to be in order to hold the pressure at the bottom of the dam.
George, are there a lot of armaments down there by the Panama Canal at each end and in the middle and everywhere else?
Yes. I don't know anymore. Once upon a time, there was part of the expenditure of the cost the United States $375 million to build this. That was money appropriated by the government. How it was appropriated probably was a little bit less clever than the way they funded the Manhattan Project, but a lot of a sizable piece of that change was building fortifications, army facilities. There has always been a military presence in the canal zone. I don't know if they had, I wouldn't be surprised if they had ground to surface to air missile, among other things. I'm not sure what else. I'm sure they started with anti-aircraft guns and coastal artillery and that sort of thing. But I suspect at this point in time, it's mostly missiles. And there may be nothing there now. I think the United States still has a presence there, but maybe Jerry would know better.
George, in 1969, the Army had a jungle course down there.
Yes, they did.
I don't know if it's still going on or when it ceased.
I don't know. Good question, Owen.
Wasn't John McCain born down there in Panama?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes,
And there was a big argument as to whether or not that qualified him to be president of the United States when he wanted to run.
that's true.
Yeah.
You know, Andrew Jackson was born on a ship off the coast. That was a big argument too, because he wasn't born in the United States, allegedly.
Hey, also, George, you'd mentioned that they bought $40 million worth of assets from the French. Were those assets up in Nicaragua?
No.
Them
Those
down?
were the assets that were left over from the French Suez Canal, and the major one of them was the Panama Railroad.
Oh, so they hauled all that stuff to Panama.
No.
No, they never did anything.
The railroad,
It was
yeah, the
already
railroad
there.
was there. Oh, yeah, the railroad was there, yeah.
Railroad was built before the first canal was built.
Yeah.
Oh.
Remained in operation throughout, and if I'm not mistaken, it's still operating today.
Yeah.
And
Here's
one of
an
the
answer.
ways during the revolution that we fomented, what the Americans did, they were in Cologne with the Nashville. There was a Colombian ship there also. The Americans wouldn't let the Colombians get on the railroad to go over to Panama City. And Panama City is where the revolution was taking place.
George, this is
Sure.
answer to Owen's question. Last army base closed in 1990. We have no military presence in Panama.
Other than if we have to go in and take a dictator down.
Yeah.
Well, guys, that was fun.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
Very-
Great
very
work.
Thanks, George.
Thanks,
Enjoyed it.
George.
Thank you.